Good afternoon, my name is Maia Romero, and today I will be presenting my research on crime victim compensation in the United States. One of the questions people might have when hearing about crime victims compensation is, well, what is it? Crime victims compensation is a financial payout given through the U.S. government to crime victims to help ease their financial burdens as a result of being a victim of crime. Crime victims compensation is paid through a program known as the Crime Victims Fund, which was established under VOCA, or the Victims of Crime Act, and is run under the Office for Victims of Crime. The Crime Victims Fund covers a wide range of different types of victims. Those can be victims of rape, burglary, or even terrorism. Those can be subject to certain rules and regulations, but that actually can vary by state. So certain states might have more regulations, certain states might have fewer regulations on who can apply, but it all depends on the state itself. The idea of crime victims compensation has actually been around for quite a long time. It actually the origins of it can be traced all the way back to things such as the Gun of Hammurabi and other ancient religious texts. The idea kind of gained more prominence during the 1950s under the social reformer Margaret Fry. She kind of brought it back into prominence. But the first actual crime victims compensation program, the first fully comprehensive one, was established in New Zealand in 1963. It was the first country to have a fully implemented crime victims compensation program. The U.S. Got its first crime victims compensation program in 1965 in California. California was the first state to have it, and as the years passed by, other states gradually began to implement their own crime victims compensation programs as time went on. Like all governmental programs, the Crime Victims Fund is without its own host of problems and issues. One of these issues is that the facilities that provide compensation or information to victims about compensation are typically understaffed and underfunded, meaning they can't provide a full range of services to the victims as they may need them. This includes helping victims fill out forms. This leaves the victims to fill out the forms by themselves, and these forms can be very long, complicated, and often require supplementary documentation, so the victims may easily be confused on what they are not supposed to provide. This can be especially prominent for non-native English speakers who may have even more difficulty filling out the forms. One of the primary problems with the Crime Victims Fund is that victims simply don't even know that it exists in the first place. One Maryland study found that less than a third of the victims surveyed even knew that the fund existed, and of that third, 70% didn't apply because they mistakenly believed that the fund would not have applied to them. Another issue is that there is a spending cap placed by Congress on the Crime Victims Fund, which limits the amount of money that they can use. Even though there's still money left over beyond this spending cap, the fund does not have access to it due to the restrictions placed by Congress, which can cause a whole other host of issues. So for the purpose of this study, I selected 10 states based on similar population sizes and crime rates, as seen in the chart below, to see what restrictions were in place for each state's crime victim compensation program in terms of victim applications. I also searched to see who the governing bodies were for each state's crime victim compensation program to better understand how they were run. All information was directly gathered from each state's crime victim compensation website. I approached each website with the perspective of a victim looking for information and based that on how what information was available and how easy it was to gain access to that information. This was done to see how easy it would be for a victim to get this information as was needed. So one of the first websites I visited was the Georgia Crime Victim Compensation website, which I found to be one of the best in terms of ease of access to information and level of detail information. This would be beneficial to a victim because not only would they be able to find the information they needed, it was very detailed and it was very easy to find. The website listed a whole list of who was eligible and who was not. It also had a list of max payout per category for compensation, and it only listed one major restriction, that being that a police report must have been filed within the first 72 hours of the incident. It also listed the 5 members of the council, them being Brian DiNapoli, Nikki Berger, Brian Tyson, Jacqueline Bunn, and Judge Juliet Scales. The second site I visited was the Crime Victims Compensation website for Alabama, which was a bit more sparse in terms of its information, but it did contain enough that a victim would be able to find what they needed. It did have a few additional requirements than Georgia did, but they were fairly similar. One of the major ones being that the victim must be an innocent victim, ergo they must not have done any sort of action that would have contributed to their victimization. It also discussed a 3-member commission who oversaw applicants. It didn't name those, didn't name any of those members on that commission, but it did state that at least one of them must have been a victim or a family member of a victim. The Arizona Crime Victims Compensation website was actually fairly similar to the Alabama website in terms of the fact that it was a bit sparse with its information and required a bit of navigation to get to, but the information was still present and was still fairly easy to access, so a victim would not have any issue finding it. The only major rule listed for Arizona was that it was a payer of last resort, meaning that a victim must exhaust other avenues for revenue, including insurance, before they would be eligible. It also stated that victims must provide all required documentation, including police reports and medical bills, anything that would show what they're seeking compensation for. Arizona had one of the largest council boards, that being a 17-member council, that had a wide variety of backgrounds included. This includes people like the Arizona Attorney General and even a Navajo County supervisor. The Colorado Crime Victims Compensation website was brief, but it did provide a lot of detailed information, so a victim would easily be able to find that, easily be able to understand it. The only major requirement stated for the Colorado website was that the victim must apply for compensation within the county that the crime was committed in. Colorado had the largest county board, being a 28-member board, but it didn't provide any information on their backgrounds or who they were. The Kentucky Crime Victim website offered almost no information at all, only a brief little description about crime victims compensation in general. It did, however, provide this information both in Spanish and English. It also mentioned a 3-member council that oversees crime victim compensation, but it didn't offer any great detail about that. Maryland's crime victim compensation offered a great detail of information, and it made it fairly easy to access. Victims would be easily able to see this and understand it. It offered a detailed list of who would be eligible and the maximum payouts per categories. It also listed 2 major requirements, that being that a victim must file a police report within the first 48 hours of the crime occurring, and that the total number of damages that the victim is seeking compensation for must at least be a minimum of $100. It did not, however, the site did not, however, provide any information on any governing body. The Michigan Crime Victims Compensation website was a little bit different than some of the other websites in that it didn't contain much information itself, but it did have several links to PDFs which contained brochures which contained a whole wealth of information about the crime victim program. If victims aren't familiar with the PDF format, they might be a bit confused by how that works, but the brochures themselves did contain a whole wealth of information that would be of great assistance to a victim. The only major requirement listed for Michigan was that the victim must fully cooperate with law enforcement during the course of the investigation. The Michigan website also had several YouTube videos posted that explained how crime victim compensation works in a little bit more detail, and victims might find that very resourceful. The brochures were also in English, Spanish, and Arabic, which provides a lot of room for different victims of different backgrounds. It didn't give on any information on any sort of governing body for the Michigan board, though. Minnesota crime victim compensation was a bit more like Georgia in terms of its formatting. It gave a detailed list of who and what would be covered. The site also provided its brochures in English, Spanish, Cambodian, Hmong, and Somali. It listed Katie Weeks as the head of both the grants and reparation programs, who was assisted by 17 other staff members, split between those 2 different groups. The New Jersey Crime Victims Compensation website was perhaps the most difficult to use, just in terms of the way that the website is laid out and structured. It makes it very difficult to find information, and while that information is there and it's fairly detailed, it can be incredibly hard to access, so a victim would probably find it very difficult to find that information when they would need it. However, the information that is provided, it only really mentions two major requirements, that being that victims must be innocent victims, and that the victim must be a resident of New Jersey, or the crime must have occurred in New Jersey. They will not cover non-residents or things that have occurred outside of the state. The director of the New Jersey Crime Victims Compensation Board is Louise T. Lester, but no other board members are specifically mentioned by name. The Virginia Crime Victim Compensation website is a bit sparse in terms of how it's structured. There's plenty of information, but it's sort of scattered all about, which would cause difficulties for victims trying to find specific sets of information. They'd have to constantly be going back and forth between different pages, which may make it difficult on them. Of the specific mentions of who is covered, the Virginia Crime Victim Compensation also specifies victims' families and Good Samaritans and their family. A Good Samaritan being somebody who is injured or killed while helping a victim of a crime. One of the other stipulations is that damages must total at least to $100, and although a commission is mentioned on the Virginia website, no other information is given about that. So in conclusion, during the course of my research, I learned a lot about what the Crime Victim Fund is and how it works. I learned about a lot of the issues plaguing the fund and how that can negatively affect victims from applying. These can be general issues with the fund, such as the fund itself being underfunded and not very well known by victims, to smaller issues such as the facilities being understaffed and underfunded themselves, which prevents them from fully helping victims and assisting them as needed. This can also include the websites themselves. While many of them did contain a lot of information and would be a very helpful resource for victims, some of the others were either not very well structured or just completely lacked information at all, which could prevent victims from applying as quickly as they need to, or just stop them from applying altogether. Because of certain external circumstances, I was unable to obtain certain sets of data that would have further investigated this issue. In the future, I'd like to go back and further this research should I be able to obtain that extra data and be able to expand this into something greater than it is right now. But thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to me speak, and hope you all have a lovely day.